When Japan surrendered in August 1945, everything in the country changed. Cities were destroyed, food was scarce, and millions of civilians were trying to survive day by day. But there was one family whose future felt even more uncertain than anyone else's: the Imperial family. For centuries, the emperor had been treated as something close to divine. His name was never spoken casually. His face was rarely shown. His presence symbolized the core of Japanese identity. During the war, the emperor's authority had been used to justify national sacrifice, loyalty, and the belief that Japan could never surrender. But now the war was over. Japan had lost. American troops were arriving across the country, and for the first time, the future of the imperial family was no longer guaranteed. Would the Allies punish the emperor? Would the monarchy be abolished? Would the imperial household disappear entirely? To understand what happened next, we need to start with the moment that changed everything. On the 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. Most people heard his voice for the first time in their lives. The language was formal and indirect, but the meaning was unmistakable. Japan would accept defeat. For Japanese civilians, the speech was shocking. For the imperial family, it was even more so. The emperor had broken centuries of tradition. His words brought an end to a war fought in his name, and the moment the broadcast ended, the family entered the most uncertain period in its history. Inside the imperial palace, emotions were mixed: relief, shame, sorrow, and fear of what the occupation would bring. The palace had been bombed. Food supplies were low. Palace staff were exhausted. The emperor was no longer a divine symbol. He was now a defeated ruler under foreign authority. What would happen to him next was unclear, but a decision had already been made at the highest level of American leadership. When the Americans began planning the occupation, some Allied leaders believed Hirohito should be punished as a war criminal. After all, he was the head of state. His name appeared on military orders, and Japan had committed atrocities across Asia. But General Douglas MacArthur, who led the occupation, had a different view. His first goal was stability. Japan was devastated and vulnerable. A power vacuum at the top, he believed, would create chaos. The emperor's defeat still held symbolic authority that could help keep the country calm and cooperative. MacArthur made a strategic decision. The emperor would remain. He would not be prosecuted. He would not be removed from the throne. Instead, the Americans would use his influence to guide Japan through reconstruction. This decision shaped everything that followed. It also created a unique situation. The imperial family survived the war not because of tradition, but because of political strategy. But survival came with a price. One of the most important events of the occupation happened on the 1st of January, 1946. Emperor Hirohito issued a written statement known today as the Human Declaration. In it, he clarified that he was not a divine being. He did not possess supernatural powers. He was a human being just like everyone else. This was a profound moment in Japanese history. The emperor's divine status had been a cornerstone of national ideology for generations. Now that idea vanished in a single announcement. For civilians, the declaration was surreal. Older generations struggled to accept it. Younger people found it easier, partly because they were already adjusting to new democratic values introduced by the occupation. Inside the palace, life changed dramatically. The imperial family had to adjust to new rules and new expectations. But before we look at those changes, we need to understand how deeply their social and political power was cut down. Forests, estates, and properties across the country. They had their own staff, their own institutions, and a tight connection to the highest levels of government. After the war, almost all of this disappeared. The American occupation dismantled the system that had supported the imperial family. New laws stripped them of sifted political authority, control over government appointments, influence over the military thufting vast land holdings, and wealth. More than 90% of the imperial household's property was confiscated and redistributed. The emperor and his relatives lost control of their financial empire and became dependent on a government budget. This loss was not just financial, it was symbolic. The imperial family was being reshaped into something new. They were no longer rulers. They were now constitutional figures with limited power and a public role that emphasized visibility rather than authority. But the most dramatic change was the redefinition of the family itself. Before the war, the imperial family included not only the emperor's immediate relatives, but also a large network of distant branches. These aristocratic families, known as the Kazoku and Shinoke, had immense privilege and influence. The occupation abolished all of them. Over 30 aristocratic households lost their titles. They became ordinary citizens overnight. Some adapted well, others struggled. A few had no skills outside court life and sank into poverty. Some became business owners. Some worked in universities. A few wrote memoirs that gave rare insight into pre-war imperial life. This mass abolition left the emperor with a much smaller circle of relatives. The modern imperial family today is a direct result of this post-war restructuring. But while the extended families lost their status entirely, the emperor's immediate household remained. They simply had to live with far less power than they were used to. The imperial palace during the occupation was a quiet, controlled environment. American officers visited regularly. The emperor met with MacArthur several times, often in private. Staff worked under new regulations. Budgets were tight. Rituals were simplified or eliminated. The emperor spent much of this period making public appearances. He visited schools, farms, factories, and disaster sites. These visits were carefully planned. They were designed to rebuild the public's trust and position the emperor as a symbol of unity rather than a ruler. Japanese civilians responded with a mix of curiosity, respect, and cautious admiration. Many had never seen the emperor in person before. Seeing him walk through their towns was a powerful moment. Members of the imperial family also adjusted. Princesses and princes who had grown up in splendid isolation now lived with reduced status. Their education changed. Their daily routines changed. Their expectations for the future changed. The emperor's children felt these changes most clearly. Emperor Hirohito had several children, including Crown Prince Akihito, who would one day become emperor. After the war, the education of the imperial children shifted dramatically. They were no longer raised to think of themselves as divine. They learned English. They studied democratic principles. They were taught to behave as public figures, not sacred icons. Crown Prince Akihito attended private schools with both Japanese and foreign teachers. He studied abroad briefly. He grew up in a world where the monarchy was symbolic, not absolute. This made him the first modern emperor shaped entirely by the post-war system. His siblings followed similar paths. Some joined cultural institutions. Some became patrons of charities. Some married commoners, which would have been unthinkable before the war. The next major shift came when Akihito became emperor in 1989. But that is part of a much larger story about the post-war monarchy. For now, we return to the immediate years after surrender. Even though the Americans protected the emperor from prosecution, he did not escape criticism. Historians, politicians, and journalists debated his wartime role. Some believed he had been a powerless figurehead. Others believed he had been deeply involved in military decisions. During the occupation, Hirohito participated in numerous interviews and inquiries. He answered questions carefully and presented himself as a leader who had been guided by advisors and constrained by tradition. Whether or not this portrayal was accurate remains debated today. What matters for this story is that the Americans accepted his explanation. They kept him on the throne. They reshaped him into a constitutional monarch, and they used him as a stabilizing force to help guide Japan toward democracy and recovery. By the early 1950s, Japan was changing rapidly. The occupation was ending. The economy was starting to revive, and the imperial family was adjusting to a new Japan. But the end of occupation did not end the transformation of the monarchy. It only marked the beginning of the post-war era. In 1952, when the occupation ended, Japan regained sovereignty. The imperial family remained, but with a new role. They became symbols rather than authorities. Their responsibility was to represent the nation in ceremonies, tradition, and diplomacy. The emperor became a figure of reflection and memory, not a ruler, not a military leader, a symbolic head of state. Hirohito embraced this role. He spent the next decades traveling across Japan, meeting civilians, visiting disaster areas, encouraging scientific education, and supporting cultural institutions. These visits softened his public image. At the same time, the government of post-war Japan carefully controlled the public portrayal of the imperial family. They were presented as peaceful, humble, and modern. Their lives became less private. Weddings and coronations were televised. The family appeared more approachable than ever before. Hirohito gradually became a symbol of continuity. He had lived through war, defeat, occupation, and recovery. He embodied Japan's resilience. When he died in 1989, many Japanese felt that an era had ended. But what about the rest of the imperial family? Crown Prince Akihito became emperor in 1989. He continued the post-war tradition of a humble, approachable monarchy. He married Michiko Shoda, a commoner. Their marriage broke centuries of tradition and symbolized how much the monarchy had changed since the war. Akihito focused on peace, reconciliation, and international diplomacy. He visited former battlegrounds. He prayed for victims on both sides. His approach helped reshape global perceptions of Japan's monarchy. His children also grew up in a modern world. They attended universities. They interacted with the public regularly. They lived under the constraints of strict public attention, but enjoyed freedoms that earlier generations could not imagine. The current emperor, Naruhito, represents a fully post-war monarchy. He was born after the occupation. His education and worldview reflect modern Japan. He sees the role of the monarchy as primarily cultural, symbolic, and deeply connected to peace. This evolution is a direct result of what happened after World War II. Even with all these changes, the imperial family faces challenges today. Their public role is demanding. The family size is shrinking. The succession system is restrictive. The pressures of modern media create stress. These issues are rooted in the post-war reforms that reshaped the monarchy. The abolition of extended branches reduced the number of potential heirs. The legal framework has changed slowly, and Japanese society continues to debate the future of the monarchy. But these challenges highlight just how far the imperial family has come since 1945. The institution survived complete national collapse, occupation, political transformation, cultural upheaval, and shifting public expectations. Its survival was never simple. It required reinvention. The story of Japan's imperial family after World War II is a story of survival through transformation. They lost their political power, their wealth, their extended network, and the divine status that once defined them. Yet they remained on the throne, not by force, but by adaptation. They became symbols of unity during the occupation. They adjusted to democratic values. They embraced new roles in public life. And over time, they helped guide Japan into a peaceful and modern era. Their experience reflects Japan's journey from defeat to recovery. A journey shaped not by glory or authority, but by resilience, humility, and the willingness to evolve.